Hi, I'm Bob Gimlin. In this video, I'm going to read a report I received, and then give my take on the matter. Hi, Bob. I'm reaching out to you because I don't believe in Bigfoot, but I haven't a clue as to what it was that I saw. I don't know if any of what I'm about to describe is typical of stories normally likened to Sasquatch, or its counterpart here in Florida, but I don't exactly have any other category to put it in. When I was 17, I participated in a private Civil War reenactment, what we call tacticals. I enjoyed them then as I enjoy them now. During the Civil War, Florida hosted a lot of small raids along the inlets and rivers darting through the coast. This is because the state was somewhat of a breadbasket for the South, and those skirmishes are what we more or less simulate. The particular tactical when I was 17 was something of a warm-up for a larger event in Marion County later that year. It was held by a horse farm, but I know we were off the farm's boundaries because we had a permit from the state. We were probably 30 minutes out of town, not the most remote place in the world, but pretty inaccessible. Foliage in Florida has an annoying tendency of growing together in large masses, and the bush formed a sort of tropical hardwood canopy. But I do want to make one thing clear, in case you're not totally familiar with Florida. My sighting took place in north-central Florida, not the Everglades. There's a big difference. Staying in character seems geeky at times, but it really alters your perspective on the life you currently live. It's frankly kind of mind-blowing to empathize with what life was like for these soldiers, many of whom were doomed to die, and statistically, not at the hands of the enemy. It makes you realize the fragility of the system we cling to. Obviously, the organizers had ways to communicate with the real world, but the majority of the participants take the events quite seriously. From Friday afternoon to Sunday morning, we suffered through 1860s life. There were a little less than 200 participants for this tactical, about 90 people on each side. The camps tended to ensnare toward each other. This is to make an enclosed space for maneuvers, more so than historical accuracy. Whenever people fan out too far, too little happens for a whole weekend. My particular camp had 7 people, and was maybe a 5-minute walk to the next friendly camp, and maybe a 15-minute walk to the nearest opposing forces camp. 15 minutes in the day, 2 or 3 times that with the assistance of only oil lamps and moon. On the second night of the tactical, the sentry on guard, who was a buddy of mine, we're all buddies though, woke me up in my tent and told me that a bowl of fruit was missing from camp. The issue was not that the fruit was gone. The issue was that it was an indictment against our camp's sovereignty. This was a game after all, and it would be a short and unpleasant one if we just crept up and bayoneted each other to death. So opposing forces often like to do stuff, like steal flags or food, to prove that they breached the perimeter undetected, whilst allowing the event to continue. We concluded that the opposing Union scouts took the bowl of fruit. These kind of hijinks are common, and even in just 2 days of minimal food reserves, a bowl of fruit is surprisingly valuable. At that time, I didn't own a period watch, and I never brought and never will bring a cell phone to a tactical event, so I hadn't a clue what time it was, which is one of those weird things about reenactments. Me and my buddy set out into the cold night to see if we could at least determine which camp was guilty of this wanton thievery. Believe it or not, Florida gets quite frigid at night. Fortunately, the night was fairly bright as we trekked down a game trail that we knew to be in the general direction of the opposing forces' camp. Even at night, there were enough game trails to make getting truly lost fairly difficult. So the worst-case scenario was really ending up somewhere that wouldn't be great in a real wartime scenario. Our goal was to get as close as possible to the opposing camp incognito and get the bowl back if possible, or something of equal or greater value. During the day, the distance would have taken 15 minutes, but at night, it turned into almost an hour's walk, especially moving quietly, with only a single lantern to avoid all the things there are to trip on. We'd been walking for about an hour before we both began to get the sense that something was off. At first, I thought we were walking into a trap, and that at any moment opposing soldiers would appear on either side of us, and our weekend would be over. But that hypothesis faded, It quickly became apparent that whatever we were feeling had nothing to do with the game. The silence was wrong. Off. I felt the stillness crawl around my neck like a scarf, sending every hair toward the sky. It was enough to make me forget about the hobnail in my shoe that dug into my heel. These sites are generally quiet. A camp of humans obviously has an effect of making animals go away. But there's always something. There's always a night bird song or crickets or heat bugs. But this time, there was nothing. It felt like gravity itself made me heavier, and that I was wading through soup, and I suddenly got a serious case of brain fog. I told myself that I was simply feeling the effects of physical exhaustion. Even pretending to be these guys is 10 times more exhausting than a day of normal life. But then we smelled it. So I guess there may be a reason that people call it skunk ape. The closest thing that could come to describing the smell is skunk spray and roadkill. I honestly thought that we must have been near a freshly killed animal. Just as we cleared the stink, we heard a whooping sound. It was definitely more like a whoop than a hoot. We said nothing at the moment we heard it. We went quiet and listened for more, but there was no noise of any kind. I guess we both had serious misgivings about the whoop, because we wordlessly agreed to abort the mission. The Yankees could keep our damn apples. With all manageable stealth, we turned around and slipped back to camp the way we came, back into the stink. After walking for 10 minutes in silence, once we were confident in our security as we neared our camp, we began to bicker about the whoop. My friend thought it had come from opposing forces, a signal from the enemy, and that we were supposed to answer with a specific response, or else they'd assume that we were combatants, which we were. But I didn't think the whoop had been made by a human. In fact, I thought it was a rhesus macaque. They're a big problem around here, an invasive species, and I knew that they carry herpes, and could be quite aggressive, which was obviously an alarming thought. At that point, I definitely thought the whoop was from a monkey, though it was deeper and throatier than I'd expect. We were still bickering about whether the whoop had come from opposing forces or herpetic monkeys when I saw it. The canopy was dark, and our eyes had been glued to the ground to avoid tripping hazards, as our light was only night sky and lantern. So I'm not sure why I looked up, but I did, and when I looked up, I saw a creature dangling off the branch of a huge oak tree. It was 20 feet off the ground and maybe 30 feet away from us. There were branches between me and it, and it was definitely high enough so that I wouldn't have noticed it unless I looked up. Again, I don't know why I looked up. I heard, saw, and smelled nothing. We watched in awe as it just kind of suspended there. It didn't seem to notice us at first. Either it didn't notice us, didn't care about us, or maybe it was relying on being still to go unnoticed. We watched it for maybe half a minute before it reacted in any way. Finally, it repositioned and looked at us, hanging like an orangutan, only this was a great deal bigger than any orangutan. It wasn't until it lumbered on top of the branch that I noticed that it was holding the fruit basket. I'm not sure if it had been nestled on its shoulder or if it had been on the branch, but I'm certain the bowl was definitely full because the fruit reflected the ambient light. I saw the yellow, red, and orange of bananas, apples, and oranges. It made quite a bit of noise as it hauled itself through the branches, though maybe it merely seemed louder because our ears were so honed to the stillness. The entire time I saw it, it never made contact with the ground. It moved much faster than we would have been able to follow in the dark. The whole creature looked a lot like a chimpanzee, but the face was very different. It had the jowls, cheeks, or whatever you want to call it, of a male orangutan. But it wasn't a chimp or an orang. It was too large, and the face too different. The fur was black, and the creature was definitely overweight. You don't think of an arboreal monkey as being fat, but this one definitely was. It was a wonder that the branches didn't snap, but they definitely bent and groaned. Orangutans and chimps have relatively short thoraxes and abdomens. This creature's body seemed longer. Its position was more like a person doing a push-up, both when it was on top of the branches and hanging from them. I imagine it moved like that to distribute its weight among multiple branches. I believe it used its knees and elbows in addition to its hands and feet. I'd say its arms were at least 5 feet long. I should also mention that it was shaggy like an orangutan, except around the face. I think the hair was sparse around the face, because it looked fleshy. I'm a bit reluctant to give an approximate weight, because I know people tend to exaggerate the size of animals. I know this fact personally, because at the time I about soiled my britches after seeing a panther up close. A later investigation of the tracks proved that the panther was probably smaller than a golden retriever. But I sure as hell don't remember it that way. But as for the creature's size, I'd say that were it standing upright, it would be a head or two taller than an average person, and shaped very differently. Standing on the ground, I'd say it would be 6 feet tall. I don't think it was a quadruped, but it seemed comfortable moving the way it did. As for weight, the thing had probably been overweight, maybe 190 to 230 pounds. I want to say 250, but maybe not. At one point, I saw it dip its feet down, and it was suspended by only its arms. The thing's feet were only 15 feet from the ground, I'd say, and the branch it clung to was at least 30 feet from the ground. So from hands to hanging feet, I think it was every bit of 15 feet long. Its body was long like a man's, but its shoulders and gut were very ape-like. It had this peculiar, almost slithering movement that was strangely uncomfortable to watch. Neither of us said anything as we watched it lumber off, but for some reason, we only moved after it crawled out of sight and into the gloom. My friend booked it first. I stayed for another few seconds and wanted to make sure I could no longer see it. When we arrived back to camp, we told command that we had spotted a large bear. I said this so that real precautions could be taken. I didn't say I saw a giant ape because I wanted the threat to be taken seriously, which it would not have been if I said I saw a gorilla-sized chimpanzee with an orangutan face. Interestingly enough, sometime that night, the bowl was returned to the mess table. Empty. It's very possible someone found it somewhere and returned it, but I wonder if maybe the thing actually put the bowl back. Also, interestingly enough, the sentry who I initially wanted to return the bowl for assumed that a bear had taken it. I guess by the mouth. Just so you know, I know him and he's not an idiot, so I find it kind of fascinating that he naturally assumed that an animal like a bear would take a bowl of fruit. I imagine that a bear would take some of the fruit, but not the bowl. Because as far as I can tell, the action of taking the bowl and not letting the fruit spill out requires hands. I guess it's just an example of how willing people are to overlook the improbable. Or maybe it's more than that. As I thought on it that night in my tent, imagining a monstrously long, inhuman arm reaching through the flap, I tried to convince myself that it was an escaped zoo or circus animal, but I didn't really believe it. I've always been interested in animals, and I know them well enough to understand that what I saw was not a known animal. A gorilla could get to that size, I think, but I don't think it was a gorilla. It was longer and more lumpy. I didn't think anything about Bigfoot or skunk ape that night. Yes, I'd heard of both, but I was convinced it was a mutant chimp or something like that. Bigfoot or skunk ape didn't occur to me. It wasn't until a later date that I realized that the Bigfoot legend is more than just a legend, and that it's actually people who have had sightings similar to mine. Looking back, had the creature been on the ground, on 2 legs, I probably would have gone straight to the Bigfoot angle. Yes, I think I could go back and locate the exact branches it clung to. I didn't return to the area the next day. No, I can't tell you why. I started this report saying that I don't believe in Bigfoot. I suppose I meant that I don't believe in a lot of what we hear about Bigfoot. I'd wager that 99% of what we hear about the matter is nonsense. However, I am certain that large creatures like the one I saw roam the wilds of Florida, and therefore, probably an awful lot of other places too. Regardless, at the end of the day, something just doesn't sit right with me. Maybe I'm just in denial, though. But denial wouldn't be denial if I knew I was in it, so I don't know. Part of me wants to believe that I just saw some strange runaway from a zoo, and I've just never heard of the species. But I don't think that's the case. I know what I saw. Your channel kind of opened my eyes to this. As you know, humans have literally taught a handful of apes basic human language. So when people say, no animal could be hiding out there, I always think, yeah, no animal, but something intelligent? What if they understand more about people than we can imagine, and how we react and respond? I'll admit that this experience has shaken me. It was over 10 years ago, and I still think of it often. Part of me completely rejects the whole idea of Bigfoot. So much about it just seems laughable. Yet here I am talking about it, and I'm not laughing. So I don't know. There's just a deep part of my brain that tells me I'm being dumb, believing in the impossible, but that doesn't change the fact that I know what I saw. And even though I know what I saw, I don't know what it was. Go ahead and share this if you would like to. Just don't give my name, or the river or farm. Anyway, thanks for listening to me. Whether you believe my account or not, it feels good to get this off my chest, and share it with someone. Okay, hi, back to me. Now I'm going to say some things about stuff, and then I'll get into the actual events of the report. First of all, I have a bit of a cold, so apologies if this narration is not up to my usual standard. My throat is sore and my lips are dry. Second, whenever I upload videos about witness reports, a small but persistent number of viewers seems skeptical as to why all the submissions are written in the same style. The implication being, I suppose, is that I make these up. And in a sense, I do write them. I guess you could say that I write them in a very limited way. See, most of these take place over many emails and occasional phone calls, and I think that just reading the transcripts of multiple communications would be rather lame. I use exact wording as much as possible to describe relevant details and events, and I also try my best to use the same voice as the witness. By voice, I mean expressions and colloquialisms that the witnesses use in our correspondence. So for the sake of full disclosure, these reports are edited to some degree. Most people don't write in a way conducive to tens of thousands of the internet's most judgmental and scrutinizing eyes. And I had to learn this lesson myself. Writing something to be spoken is totally different from writing something to be read, which is why wedding speeches are so fun, by the way. What sounds decent written in the sanctity of one's home often doesn't translate to the stranger's ear. So these reports are not word for word, though I do tend to keep them pretty close, actually. An example of this is how sometimes I put the questions and answers at the end, and sometimes I incorporate them into the narrative. In this video, I did the latter. I used to make witness reports in the third person, but I felt it grew terribly redundant to constantly say, he saw, he went, he said, he told me, then he said, then he did. So I shifted to the first person, the I saw, I went point of view. But I think I just might shift back to the third person, because I do think it seems a bit more authentic that way. Okay, so now to the actual events of the report. The first thing that struck me with this one was when I read that the witness saw the creature holding the bowl of fruit. I definitely had a moment where I just kind of said, really? I guess I hadn't been expecting it. You can look at that detail as a coincidence. The creature took the fruit basket, and then they happened upon it. Or you can look at it as if the creature is intelligent. Even monkeys do things that are strange, and have motives that are entirely their own. The people were playing a game after all. Perhaps a third party joined. Monkey see, monkey do, I suppose is the phrase. So the fact that the witness was searching for the bowl, and that the creature had the bowl, is just one of those details that makes me wonder about a great deal of things. As far as the creature itself is concerned, at first I thought the description was different from what we usually hear, but after sitting with this encounter for some time, I came to the conclusion that it's actually not so different from most Bigfoot reports. We just rarely hear about them in trees. I should say relatively rarely. Of course, that doesn't mean they don't often go in trees. It just means they're rarely spotted in trees. I found one detail rather interesting. He said that he thought the creature was 15 feet long when it was suspended from only its hands, with the rest dangling down. But then later, he said that upright, or standing, he'd guessed that it would be 6 to 6.5 feet tall. And then he guessed its arms were 5 feet long, meaning if it was 6 feet tall, plus hanging from 5-foot arms, then it should only be more like 10 or 11 feet long, not 15. At first, this may seem like a contradiction, but perhaps not. These creatures are always described as hunched, to some extent, with bent legs, meaning that their standard upright posture is not totally elongated, but hanging from its hands, and therefore allowing gravity to do its work. Perhaps they would be a great deal taller than their posture normally allows. The witness also insisted that it was overweight, and I think that may be another indication that the creature, though in a tree, is not functionally arboreal. Perhaps it would have looked quite standard on the ground. I've heard it said that these creatures are different in the South, more ape-like, but I just don't know. How much variation between subspecies can we expect, or are there different species? And if so, how many unknown species can there possibly be? I just don't know. Anyway, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more soon-to-come content. I have not one but 2 all-time most requested videos currently in the works, so I'm excited about that. Anyway, and as always, thanks an awful lot for listening.